Welcome back to the Natural History of the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Abe Lloyd, and I'm at Tennant Lake, which is a great place for exploring three different types of wetlands. We have a really good marsh with a boardwalk going through it. We have wet meadows along the edge of the marsh, and also some shrub wetland along the edge of the marsh. So today we're going to be thinking a lot about plant adaptations. We'll cut some plants open and look at the specialized tissues that they have for growing in saturated soil conditions. We'll of course do some identification of plants and animals, and I'm quite certain we're going to get some looks at birds and at least be able to bird a bit by ear, and probably look at some aquatic invertebrates as well. So join me as we explore Tennant Lake. Let's look for some hydric soils. This is a good spot. Even though this is old farm field here now, I'm sure this used to be a more diverse, rich wetland. Okay, I'm here to cut through that sod. This is all reed canary grass. Monoculture of reed canary grass. All right. Sound of the wetland. All right. So recall from lecture how wetland soils are anoxic, which means that they are the sediments in them and the organic compounds in them are decomposing without oxygen, and that creates a high environment for reduction, which means that the ions in the soil aren't going to oxidize and turn red, but they're going to be reduced and be kind of a gray color. And so we do see this grayish color, sign of reduced scale. So of course another component of the wetland is just that there's water within 12 inches of the soil surface, and that's a no-brainer here. It's within 2 inches of the soil surface. So we have hydric soils, we have water, and then wetland vegetation is another thing we would need to look for. And in an environment like this, it's a little more challenging because this is an old farm field, and so all the vegetation was destroyed to make way for pasture for cattle. But some is starting to come back. Reed canary grass is certainly taking over, but in this, as we walk along this farm field margin, we'll see some other wetland plants. So we got to make sure to replace our divots. There we go. Reed canary grass is a facultative wetland plant, so it can grow in areas that are wet between 2/3 of the time and all of the time. And to identify reed canary, well, to start, grasses we can identify because they have nodes or joints. And there's a good mnemonic. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have joints all the way to the ground, or the college version is grasses have joints that they all pass around. Haha. Okay, so what's a joint in the grass? This here is a grass joint from an old reed canary grass stem. And a good feature for identifying reed canary grass at this time of the year is the ligule. So this is a grass leaf called the blade, and this is what's called the culm, or the stem. And the ligule is where the leaf wraps around the culm, so I could see the papery sheath, so to speak, of the ligule, which clasps the stem. So I mentioned sedges, that they have edges, and here is our first sedge. It's called slough sedge. And slough sedge, ooh, it's pollinating right now. Slough sedge is probably our most common lowland sedge. And it, so what does it mean that it has edges? Well, usually what they're talking about, the most edgy part of the sedge is the culm again, and it has a triangular cross-section. Try and get you a good look at that triangularness. So if I pinch it real good, that the stem or the culm is triangular. And so that gives the edges of those triangular bits an edginess to them. And frequently with sedges, the leaves are also quite edgy. Some of them so much that if you rub your hand along the stem the wrong way, you can get cut. And I did this a month ago while camping. It's healed now, but I grabbed some and tried to rip them out, and it cut me so deeply that I needed stitches. So the leaves of the sedges should be handled with caution. Okay, so some features for slough sedge. You could see these flowers, and it has male and female flowers. So the ones with the white, those are the female flowers, and up higher are the male flowers, the ones that release the pollen. The female flowers will mature into the seeds, and the male flowers will just wither away and die. And sedges have a whole bunch of specialized terminology that I'm not going to get into. But if you're interested, I recommend taking my wetland plant identification class during the summer, and we will learn a lot more about the flora found in our local wetlands. So last in the little poem that we just learned is the, leak in my boot, are the rushes. So here's a clump of rushes, one of the most common rushes, aptly named common rush. And the rush is very, very round in cross section. And this one grows in clumps, so you can see all the stems are attached at one point, or come from one rhizome at the base. One of the great things about Tennant Lake is that there's a boardwalk, and so we have easy access to a lot of different wetland plants that normally we would have to wade or swim in to get, which is no fun on a field trip, even a virtual field trip. So wetland plants, how do they survive in such a wet environment? Well, it turns out most of them have a common adaptation, something that I like to call the snorkel adaptation, for allowing them to transport gas from above the water surface, where there's lots of gas moving around, down to below the water surface where they're attached to the ground in these anoxic soil conditions. So I want to point out a few of those special plant tissues, the plant snorkels. We'll start here with this one. If I cut this stem, what I'll see is that the inside is filled with very spongy tissue. This is technically called parenchymus tissue. So we could see the parenchymus tissue, the cells are much longer than they are wide, and that facilitates the transport of gas more easily up and down the stem, which is important to get that gas all the way down to the roots. So this is the bulrush. Let's take a look at a few other wetland plants. Here is horsetail. We'll notice that the inside of the horsetail stem is hollow. And let me cut a cross section so that you can more easily see that hollowness. Might be a hard one. The pond lily also has parenchymus tissue. And the cattail as well. All right, you ever see a sheen on the water like this here? It does look like oil pollution, but this is actually naturally occurring bacteria, and I think it's called heterocont, and which is just a type of, actually it's a protist, and the heteroconts float to the surface and form a colony, a sheen-like colony that looks a little bit like oil, but it's natural and not to be alarmed about. Let's poke one and see what happens.
Oh, shoot.
Many wetland plants are herbaceous, which means that they die back to a root every winter. And this is a charismatic plant that is common in marshes called cattail, and this portion is dead. It was last year's flowering stem, but it's persisted over the winter. And it's recognizable because it looks a little bit like a hot dog on a stick. And these are the female flowers. They mature into seeds, and right now the birds are collecting this down to line their nests with. We actually have a pillow at home that we've stuffed with, or a friend made it for us, stuffed with cattail fluff. So cattails are very indicative of a marsh, and they are easy to recognize, and they have a lot of great uses too. The stems, the leaves are really soft and can be used like a thermarest or a sleeping mat, and indigenous peoples weave mats to sleep on out of the stems, and there are a lot of edible tissues too, and I'll show you that. On my way over to get some cattail to show you more closely, encountered this alder stem that's been chewed off. This is a good sign that a beaver is in the area, and beavers love eating cattails too. So do muskrats. They're very edible. So here is the shoot of a cattail, and this is a good time of the year for actually gobbling on them. You can just strip off the leaves until you get down to the clean white inner tissue, and I want to cut off that dirty bit. You can just munch on that, and it has a mild citrusy flavor. Smells like watermelon. You can never go hungry when you're in a marsh. But you don't want to confuse your nice edible cattail with this plant here, which is yellow flag iris, and this is a non-native plant. It's been introduced into the marsh system, and you can see that when I cut it in cross-section it is flattened, whereas the cattail in cross-section is more round. So the yellow flag iris typically grows in shallower waters, like here on this grassy margin, whereas the cattail usually grows in slightly deeper waters. So you'll need to know both for the upcoming quiz. So we'll take some water quality measurements here. I'm curious about temperature and dissolved oxygen, so we'll start with that. Remembering to take the case off. This probe has a nice long cord. Everything is stabilized now. I have 13.9 degrees Celsius, 1.65 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen at 16%. So that's not a lot of dissolved oxygen in this water, and let's think about why that might be. Well, unlike the shoreline where wave action was continually increasing the surface area and allowing a lot of oxygen to dissolve into the water, here this is a flat body of water with no wave action at all. And furthermore, we have a lot of organic matter in the water here. So as that organic matter decomposes, the bacteria that decompose it need aerobic, or they're organisms that respire, and so they need oxygen, so they take the dissolved oxygen out of the water. Furthermore, plants during the night, they also respire, the dark cycle. So I would expect that if we were to take this measurement again in an hour after more photosynthesis has happened, the plants, the submerged leaf plants and floating leaf plants in the water, they're going to be producing oxygen from photosynthesis, and they will actually increase the dissolved oxygen concentration in the water. So marshes are typically have quite a lot of variation in their dissolved oxygen just based on the time of day and like wind conditions and things like that. Here's a test we didn't do on the shorelines unit. This probe measures electrical conductivity, and so it has two little electrodes at the tip, and a current passes between those electrodes. And right now in the air it has very poor conductivity because air isn't conductive to electricity. If I put it in pure water without any ions in it, like a deionized water, it would have poor conductivity. But if I put it in salt water with a ton of ions, it would have super high conductivity. So essentially, ions in water sometimes are pollutants, so this can give us an idea if there are pollutants or not, but it won't actually tell us what the pollutants are. So this one goes pretty quick. I just turn it on and stick it in the water, and I get a reading of 120, and it has the little U with the tail on it and S. That stands for microsiemens per I think centimeter, which is the distance between the two electrodes. So what does that number tell us? Well, again, it just is telling us that there are ions in solution. If I did this in the salt water, it would probably have been 100 or more times higher, because salt is an ion and there's lots of that in salt water. So we just have to compare to different wetlands, and we'll do that. We're going to go to a stream and a lake in future units. Oh, cool. Look at see the male blackbird feeding on the pond lilies. That's really great. Canada goose flying by. It's a good day for wildlife. Blackbirds are great because they're all field marked. They're called red-winged blackbird, and that's all you can see is a blackbird with a red spot on this one. So there's a female foraging as well, a little closer. How nice. Alright, so the last reading we'll take is for pH, and it's telling us, gotta go in here for a second, it's basically stabilized at about 7.7 or 7.71. So slightly alkaline, but not very much. Pretty close to neutral. Let's take a look at some of the vegetation here. So remember in lecture I was talking about emergent vegetation, floating vegetation, and submerged leaf vegetation. We got a nice mix here. So pond lilies are kind of the classic floating leaf vegetation. Sometimes they stick out of the water a little bit. And here is one called bog buckbean with 3 leaflets. It's an emergent plant, as is this marsh cinquefoil. So if I cut both of them open, just like most other wetland plants, I'm sure it has, this one actually has a hollow stem, so it's a better snorkel than the other ones. I could use it as a snorkel. I still might drown. Okay, and then how about some submerged leaf plants? Here we could see that the leaves are actually underwater on this water smartweed. But what's more typical for submerged leaf plants, is that they have very fine leaves. If it's a plant that is totally submerged, it has to do all its gas exchange underwater, and so the plant has a very high surface area to volume ratio on the leaves so that it can do all that gas exchange. So they're very feather-like. Put this in a tray so you can see how they fan out like feathers for better gas exchange. So a few other cool marsh plants. We have duckweed, which is actually the smallest flowering plant in North America. Nice little statistics for you. And then this one here is called water shield, and it has a stem that comes out of the very center of the leaf, but it just floats on the water surface. Looks kind of like the pond lily leaf, except the pond lily has the stem, the edge of the leaf margin comes to the stem and makes a big heart shape. Whereas the water shield, well, this one has a bite taken out of it, but normally the stem comes out of the center of the leaf. Little mayfly in there too. That's cool. An aquatic invertebrate, and soon it'll be climbing on top of a, ooh, there's actually one on the top of this leaf here, and drying out and growing leaves, not leaves, wings, and flying away. It's May now, May 1st, happy May Day. Pond lilies have brilliantly yellow flowers that are very large, and they actually produce seeds that are edible. I've tried them and they're okay, but they used to be really important to the Willamette people, who call them waucus down in Oregon. You could see a damselfly sunning itself on a pond lily leaf. Pond lilies are kind of analogous to the trees in a forest. They provide the bulk of the structure for the floating leafed part of a marsh. This is the emergent larvae of a dragonfly. They crawl up and find a place to sun themselves and then break out of the back of the case and fly away. So the aquatic form lacks wings. They just, this one is actually predaceous. It eats other aquatic invertebrates. But when they mature, they sprout wings and they fly away and find other members of their kind to reproduce. Tennant Lake has some really good shrub communities, and dominant along the edge here is a plant called Myrica, spelled M-Y-R-I-C-A. It's a Myrica! And it smells so delightful. If you just rub the leaves, or especially these buds, and smell them, you'll be in heaven. So this is Myrica Gale. It's the scientific name, and people just call it Myrica as the common name. Or Sweet Gale, actually, is the common name. In this shrub wetland, there's also quite a bit of willow, and there's two different types of willow. This one here with the yellow catkins is called Pacific willow, and everything about the Pacific willow is slightly yellowish. You could see that the twigs also have a yellowish cast to them. And the leaf margins are very finely serrated. Pacific willow gets to be much taller than the rest of our willows. It'll be a small tree, whereas many of the rest of our willows stay more in a shrub form. But because the soils are very saturated here, the Pacific willow growing here is never going to get that tall. It's just a difficult environment for woody plants. It's an easy time of the year to spot black twinberry. Right now, instead of having a twin of berries, it has a twin of flowers. And everything about this plant is opposite, so it's got a pair of flowers, and the leaves are in pairs as well. And that's common for all honeysuckles to have opposite leaves and flowers. And this is a pretty woody plant, and if I recall correctly, it has a slightly hollow. I don't recall correctly. Never mind. It's got a pithy core rather than a hollow core, so it isn't quite the parenchyma that we saw on those herbaceous wetland plants, but pith is very soft tissue and does enable gas diffusion down into the roots. More shrub wetland here. You can see a lot of alders and bigger Pacific willows. There's a whole family of plants called the willow family, and they all have catkins for flowers. So the flowers are born in an inflorescence that's called a catkin. And we saw this individual, I brought it along, of the Pacific willow with the catkin of male flowers. You can see the yellow stamens. Now, many willows, maybe even all willows, have male and female flowers on different plants, which is the technical word for that is dioecious, meaning two houses. And next to me here, I picked one, is the female catkin. So these flowers are only female flowers, the pistils. But regardless, they are both catkins. They just happen to be born on different plants, whereas the red alder has male and female catkins on the same plant. Beside me is Douglas spirea, or sometimes called hardhack, and last year's flower is present, but it's long gone. I mean, long done being floral. And I think this has a good name because it grows in such big thickets that when you try and get through it, it's really hard. So they call it hard hack. Imagine being a surveyor trying to hack your way through a straight line following a property line or something like that. You might give this plant the same name. Here are some spirea leaves. You can see that they have serrated margins and they tend to be longer than they are wide. Canada geese, like ducks, feed on vegetation, so they'll nibble at the base of those cattail leaves, and they might eat the base of the yellow pond lily flowers and some other aquatic plants. Looks like they're just resting on a log now, though. Seems like every year I come here there's a marsh wren hanging out on the top of that spirea bush. Probably too small to see on the camera, but marsh wrens are very distinctive, have a very distinctive call. Chatter, chatter, chatter. Here's a northwest salamander egg sac. It's a good find. Like a bowl full of jelly. A song sparrow calling. It's a nice close look at it too. Remember how I was talking about submerged leaf plants and how they often have feather-like leaves to increase the surface area? Well, this plant here actually starts out as a submerged plant when the water levels are high in the spring. And then, so the first leaves that grow have a lot of feathery surface area. But then the leaves that grow later have even less. And eventually the leaves will have no serrations at all. They'll just be smooth leaf margins. And this is called this plant is called water parsnip. We got another horsetail species here. And note how this horsetail hardly has any hair on its tail, I guess you could say. Just little teeny side branches. And if I squeeze it, it has a real wimpy stalk. The inside is actually totally hollow. This would be the best snorkel of all the ones we've seen so far. And this is called river horsetail. So we've seen marsh horsetail and river horsetail, and both of them love growing in wetlands. But the marsh horsetail has 5 or 9 or something like that small holes on the inside, kind of that look like a honeycomb pattern, whereas the river horsetail just has one giant hole. So the river horsetail is does the best at moving air down to the roots and can grow in the deepest water. A few more little shrubs. This is called black hawthorn, named because of its thorny stem. And you don't want to get stabbed by these thorns. The tips of the thorns will break off inside your flesh, and they always seem to get infected. Black hawthorn has big black berries that are not super big, but about the size of your thumbnail. And they're edible, but they're kind of mushy and not very tasty. Here we have a plant that's called water plantain. Again, we have that plantain word. We saw rattlesnake plantain, which is in the orchid family. Well, this water plantain is in a totally different family, the Alismataceae. Anywho, it loves growing in wet areas that dry up seasonally. So on the side of the trail here, if you come back in a month, it will be dry, and the plant will then be, maybe 3 or so feet tall. So here at Tennant Lake, we've seen a lot of different plants and animals and thought about how they are adapted to the wetland environment. I just want to give you a heads up that typically the quiz for this wetland unit is more difficult for people than the previous quizzes because the plants are so different than plants they're used to seeing. So be sure and spend extra time studying. And that's all for this week. So thanks everybody for joining me.